So last time we had started 19.4 and we were talking about where your blood really is found, because you do have an uneven distribution, as it says here. The systemic venous system has 64% of the total blood volume, and of that, 1 liter is in the venous networks that carry the blood from the digestive organs to the liver. So that really is your blood reservoirs. Systemic arteries have about 13% of the total blood volume, the remaining blood, and the systemic capillaries, the heart, pulmonary circuit. So this breaks that down for you. Okay, so even though you don't have a lot of muscle in the veins, you do have venoconstriction, and this can be done by contraction of smooth muscle fibers that are in the veins, what little there is. It reduces the diameter of the veins, which also then reduces the amount of blood in the system. And the method of maintaining blood volume in the arterial system is part of this as well, even with a significant blood loss. And that can be controlled by the vasomotor centers and the medulla oblongata, the sympathetic nerves that stimulate smooth muscles, and the medium-sized veins. Okay, so as you can imagine, if you constrict the veins, blood is going to basically pull a little bit behind it, which increases the amount of bloods in the arterial system. Right? It only makes sense, because you're basically shutting the highway down a little bit, or slowing it down, like a bottleneck. So this shows the sympathetic nerve innervation. Shows the smooth muscles contracting, and therefore you get a smaller lumen inside and less blood can flow through. Okay, this next section, 19.5, we're going to talk about effects of pressure, resistance, and venous return on the cardiac output. We'll talk about the factors that influence the peripheral resistance. We'll describe the factors that determine the blood flow. We'll talk about movement of fluids between the capillaries and the interstitial spaces. Then we'll go into some detail about central regulation and autoregulation and the baroreceptor reflexes that you heard about in that video from Crash Course A&P, that part 2 of blood vessels. And these things happen in response to changes in the blood pressure and blood composition. We'll talk about how hormones are involved in regulation of blood pressure and blood volume. And we'll talk about the role of the chemoreceptor reflexes to adjust that cardiovascular activity. And then finally, we'll explain how the cardiovascular system responds to the demands of exercise. And we'll follow up with a clinical module. So, cardiovascular regulation is accomplished by adjusting the cardiac output. So you have to generate enough pressure that forces blood through literally miles of peripheral capillaries. If you put all those capillaries empty in, you actually have miles of capillaries. And the second part is blood flow regulation within the systemic and the pulmonary circuits. Okay, so cardiovascular regulation is through cardiac output and blood flow regulation in the systemic and pulmonary circuits. Autoregulation, auto means self. So this acts locally in particular areas. Central regulation involves neural and endocrine mechanisms. So here we have a coordinated adjustment for heart rate, stroke volume, peripheral resistance, venous pressure, so that your cardiac output will be sufficient. The pulsing of your heart generates pressure. So we're talking about contractions. And when we talk about blood pressure, we're talking about pressure within the cardiovascular system as a whole. Arterial pressure in particular is generally going to be higher than the venous pressure, it should be. And that's so that you can push blood a greater distance through the smaller vessels. The flow through these blood vessels will be influenced by the resistance. So that's the force that opposes the movement. And if we talk specifically about peripheral resistance, we're talking about resistance of the arterial system as a whole. and this increases as the vessels get smaller. As you can imagine, the smaller the lumen of the vessels, the less liquid that can get through at a time, or in this case the blood, and therefore that increases the pressure. Now, capillaries are incredibly small, and we talked about this last time. In some cases, you can only get maybe one blood cell through at a time. So blood flow in the capillaries is very slow. Capillary pressure is also very low. It allows plenty of time for capillary exchange, so it's important that we have that slow movement so that we can have diffusion between the blood and interstitial fluid. Now, luckily, we have lots of capillaries, and this is one reason why that we actually have low pressure in the capillaries. Now, what we said earlier might have sounded anti-sensical because we were saying as we decrease the size of the vessel, you increase resistance, which makes you think, well, you ought to also increase pressure. But you have to think that we also have a lot of capillaries. So we're spreading out the flow of the blood in lots of vessels. So the blood pressure in your veins will be maintained by the valves, muscular compression of the peripheral veins. And on the other side of the capillaries, the blood is moving towards the heart and the vessels are actually getting larger. And your resistance then decreases. Venous return, this is the amount of blood that arrives at the right atrium each minute. And on average, it's equal to the cardiac output. And it should be. If it's not, you got to question where that extra blood is going to. So this graphic shows what we were just talking about. So again, in general, your pressure decreases as you move from the heart to the capillaries and then back to the heart. Okay, your vessel luminal diameter is the main source of resistance in the cardiovascular system. So if we talk about total peripheral resistance, this is the resistance of the entire cardiovascular system. It has to be overcome by enough pressure from the heart so that you actually have circulation. And your total peripheral resistance will depend on the vascular resistance, the viscosity of the blood, and the turbulence, which we will describe all three. So vascular resistance, the opposition to blood flow in the vessels, that is the largest component of your total peripheral resistance. And where does that come from? Well, basic friction between the blood and the vessel walls. And that friction is dependent on the vessel length and the vessel diameter. Looking at those two components, vessel length, friction occurs between the vessel walls and moving blood, and as you have an increase in your vessel length, you have an increased surface area, and therefore it increases in your friction or your resistance. So the longer the vessel, the more friction, the more resistance. And the largest change we're going to see when it comes to vessel lengthening, of course, is going to be between birth and maturity as the person is growing. And we also said diameter has an impact on vascular resistance. Friction occurs between the moving fluid layers. The layer closest to the vessel wall is slowed most because that's where most of your friction occurs against the surface. And the effect gradually diminishes away from the wall. So as you're in the very center of the lumen, you have a lot less friction. So in your smaller vessels, more fluid volume is near your wall, obviously, so you have higher resistance in the smaller vessels. In larger vessels, you have a larger central region that's unaffected, so you have lower resistance if you have a larger diameter vessel. And this graphic shows how the luminal diameter has an impact on friction, therefore resistance. So at the center, you have the greatest flow. Diameter has a much larger effect on resistance compared to the vessel length. This is expressed with this equation. Resistance is equal to 1 over the radius to the 4th power. So what this really says is even a small change in your diameter produces a large change in resistance. So when you ever have 1 over a variable, every time you increase this number in the bottom, that decreases your overall number, right? So if you have 1/4, then you go to 1/10, 1/25. Look how much smaller that number is getting. And that's the point being made here. That's how much smaller resistance gets as your radius. And radius, remember, is half diameter. You remember from geometry from years ago. So they're just pointing out that with every little increase in the diameter of that tube, your resistance actually decreases greatly. I think I might have said that a little backwards, but anyway. So as that bottom number gets larger, your overall number gets much smaller. The vasomotor centers controlled peripheral resistance primarily by altering the diameters of the arterioles. So this shows an example of the difference in a 2 centimeter diameter versus a 1. Look, by just decreasing the diameter in half, your resistance in flow is decreased 16 times. Okay, viscosity, the resistance to flow caused by interactions among molecules and suspended materials in a liquid. Low viscosity, this means you have a low resistance, so flow is at a low pressure. So water has a pretty low viscosity, let's say it's 1.0. High viscosity fluids have higher resistance, so flow only at high pressures. A good example of really a high viscous fluid is molasses. You ever had any of that? You can't exactly just pour it out of a container, can you? It takes a long time to anyway. So the viscosity of that is 300 times the viscosity of water. Blood viscosity is about 5 times water. That's because the cells and plasma proteins in it. Your viscosity is normally pretty stable. Blood disorders can affect the hematocrit or the blood plasma composition, change in the viscosity, and therefore affecting the peripheral resistance. So this chart shows you relative viscosity. Okay, turbulence is also something else that affects peripheral resistance. So this has to do with, do you have lots of eddies and swirls and all kinds of obstructions and things like that in the vessels, and do the vessels have a lot of curves in it? So the type of fluid flow with eddies and swirls is turbulence, caused by high flow rates, irregular surfaces, sudden changes in vessel diameter. This is responsible for the production of 3rd and 4th heart sounds. And those are normal turbulent flows in the heart. But if you do end up having increased turbulence, that increases your resistance and therefore slows your blood flow. Okay, so if plaque builds up inside of a vessel, this increases your turbulence. Okay, so do you remember those factors we just talked about that contribute to total peripheral resistance? So name some of the ones we were just talking about.
Viscosity, turbulence.
Viscosity,
Turbulence.
turbulence, Go back some. There's turbulence, viscosity. What was number 1? Okay, so we talked about vessel length and diameter, basically. Okay, let's talk about blood flow now. The volume of blood flowing per unit of time through a vessel or a group of vessels is your blood flow. It is directly proportional to your arterial pressure, so that just means as arterial pressure increases, so does blood flow. It's inversely proportional to peripheral resistance. So that means as peripheral resistance increases, blood flow decreases. And more important than absolute pressure is what they call a pressure gradient. So if you have a difference in pressure from one end of a vessel to the other, that can lead to a greater blood flow. The largest gradient from the base of the aorta and the proximal end of the capillary beds gives us a good difference in pressure gradient, allowing us to have, or it's set up for a good flow of blood, hopefully. We also have changes in diameter as you go from the aorta to the capillaries. Big difference. Blood vessels diverge and they branch. We have decreasing diameters that increase resistance, which decreases pressure and decreases flow. And then from the capillaries to the vena cava. And then on the other side, the blood vessels converge to form larger vessels. You have increasing diameter, which decreases the resistance, and that helps with increased flow. But going back here, we want decreased flow, remember, when we're in the capillaries, so that you have good exchange of nutrients and gases. So this graphic shows how the luminal diameter changes as you go from the large arteries all the way to capillaries, then to the large veins. So obviously along all this we have changes in blood pressure. The highest pressure is at the aorta. The heart generates pressure of about 120 millimeters of mercury, and the aortic cross-sectional area is 4.5 square centimeters. And at each branch in the arterial system, the pressure drops. The smaller, more numerous vessels produce more resistance. This reduces the pressure. At the start of the peripheral capillaries, pressure is 35 millimeters of mercury. And at the venules, pressure is 18 millimeters of mercury. So you see how much it's reduced there. And this graphic shows that pretty dramatically. The change in blood pressure as you move from the aorta to the vena cava. When we look at blood flow, the highest flow is in the aorta. That's also your highest blood pressure, the largest diameter. Blood flow is slowest in the capillaries. You have the smallest diameter. You have slow flow that's important to allow for the exchange, as we keep saying. And then the flow accelerates in the venous system because you have larger diameter vessels and therefore lower resistance. So we just, at that point, want to get it back to the heart. And this graphic shows the velocity of blood flow as you go from aorta to capillaries and then back to the vena cava. Now notice that your blood flow never gets back to where it was when it came out of the aorta. And again, what is it that is allowing blood to increase in flow rate by the time you get up here? What is it that's allowing this increase in flow at the right side of this graphic? What's responsible for that increase in flow there? It's less resistance. Why? And it's really simple. What changes in those vessels as you go from here to here? Well, let's talk about the vessels themselves, the structure.
The sizes, it gets bigger.
Okay, yeah, larger vessels. That's all we've done. And by increasing the size of the vessels, you have less resistance, and therefore your flow can get larger. Okay, changes in arterial pressure. It rises during ventricular systole. What does the word systole mean? Contraction. The peak pressure is measured during systole, and we refer to that as systolic pressure. It declines during ventricular diastole. And the minimum pressure that's measured during diastole is called diastolic pressure. And we commonly write it with this sign between the pressure readings, like 120/90. And your laboratory went into this in the last class. Those of you that have Lab on Monday will learn more about pressures and taking pressures. But this is really a range of pressures. This basically says the range of pressures that exist in that vessel are anywhere between 90 and 120. Okay, pulse pressure. So we have some other terms we have to use also. Pulse pressure is the difference between the systolic and diastolic pressure. So you basically subtract the bottom number from the top number. And that really is your range of pressure difference. And then another important calculation is mean arterial pressure. You add 1/3 of your pulse pressure to your diastolic pressure. Your diastolic, again, is that bottom number. So you take 1/3 of the top number and you add to the bottom number. And these numbers can tell us something about that person's system and their health. Okay, so this graphic shows us how pulse pressure and mean arterial pressure generally change as we leave the left ventricle and move to the capillaries and then to the vena cava. Okay, capillary exchange. So this is where the important stuff happens. We have diffusion occurring and osmosis and filtration. An important term that we use here is capillary hydrostatic pressure. This is the blood pressure within the capillary beds that drives filtration. It pushes water and small molecules out of the bloodstream into the interstitial fluid where the cells are. But the larger molecules, like the plasma proteins, they stay in the blood because they cannot fit through the pore spaces. So this is filtration. Okay, diffusion also occurs. That's just movement of something from higher to lower concentration. And this happens most quickly if the distance is short, if the concentration gradient is large. That means if you have a much greater concentration on one side than the other. And if the ions or the molecules involved are very small. And this has always occurred across the capillary walls. But the way it's being moved varies depending on what substance we're talking about. And this shows the different ones. Water ions, small organic molecules, glucose, amino acids, urea. They enter and leave the bloodstream by diffusion between the adjacent endothelial cells and through the pores of the fenestrated capillaries. A lot of your ions, like sodium, potassium, calcium, chloride, diffuse across the endothelial cells by passing through channels in the membranes. The large water-soluble compounds, they're not able to enter or leave the bloodstream except at the fenestrated capillaries, like at the hypothalamus or the kidneys are the endocrine organs and some of the intestinal tract. Lipids, like the fatty acids and steroids, lipid-soluble materials like soluble gases, oxygen and CO2. They can cross the capillary walls by diffusion through the endothelial cell's plasma membrane fairly easily because the inside of the membrane is hydrophobic, and so are lipids. And plasma proteins are normally unable to cross the endothelial lining except in the sinusoids, like at the liver. At the arterial end of the capillary, so we're going to look at both ends of the capillary. If we start at the arterial end, which is the entrance, filtration is the mechanism that predominates. So capillary hydrostatic pressure is obviously going to be important to push things across, and it's highest near the arteriole. It causes water and small solutes to get into the interstitial fluid. And as we have filtration occurring, the blood colloid osmotic pressure increases because we're getting rid of a lot of water in the smaller solutes, but we're maintaining a lot of your large proteins. So water leaves the capillary, the plasma proteins remain, so your capillary hydrostatic pressure will decrease along the capillary length as you get to the other end. So as long as your capillary hydrostatic pressure is greater than the blood colloid osmotic pressure, then the fluid's forced out of the capillary. And think of it this way: if you have a high blood colloid osmotic pressure, that means you have a lot of solutes inside, and it's going to want to hold on to water and things like that. So it's going to be harder to get that water out if you have a lot of solutes inside. If you just remember osmosis when we discussed this last semester, water wants to move towards where you have a lot of solutes, right? If you have high salt inside of something, water wants to move into it. So it's hard to get the water out of it if you got a lot of salts inside. It's just like your body's naturally too. If you've eaten a lot of salts, your body wants to retain water. So you can think of it that way. So that's all we're saying here, is you have to have a lot more pressure to get the water and small solutes out if you have a lot of solutes inside. So luckily you have high hydrostatic pressure at the beginning. Now, net filtration pressure, this is the difference between the capillary hydrostatic and the blood colloid osmotic pressure. So if it's positive, then that's a good thing and filtration can happen. That means you can push the water out in small solutes. If it's negative, then the opposite thing's going to happen. You're going to have more stuff come into your capillary. Well, at the beginning of the capillaries, at the arterial side, your net filtration pressure is positive, and therefore filtration is going to occur, and you're able to push out water and the smaller solutes, like nutrients, right? And you want that to happen. But at the end of the capillaries, you want the opposite thing to happen. Now you want to bring back some of the water and the CO2. So now you've got a negative net filtration pressure. Now you can have reabsorption, and now you're going to pull fluids off of the tissues. Okay, at roughly 2/3 of the way along the capillary, no real net movement, because capillary hydrostatic pressure equals blood colloid osmotic pressure. So not much is happening at that point. So at the veinal end, as we said, you have low hydrostatic pressure, therefore reabsorption is going to predominate. That means stuff's going to come into the blood vessels. Capillary hydrostatic pressure falls below the blood colloid osmotic pressure. Water moves into the capillaries. More water is going to leave the bloodstream than is reabsorbed, and we have a difference about 3.6 liters per day entering the lymphatic vessels, which is eventually returned to the venous system. Okay, so this graphic shows all of those movements. So again, at the arterial end, filtration predominates. At the venual end, reabsorption predominates. Now we have different variations in this exchange. If there's a condition that affects your blood pressure, your osmotic pressure, this can shift the balance. So they give some examples. If you have hemorrhaging, both your blood volume and blood pressure decline. That decreases your hydrostatic pressure lower than the net filtration pressure. That increases the amount of capillary reabsorption, and therefore you get a reduction in the volume of the interstitial fluid and increase in circulating blood volume. We call that recall of fluids. If dehydration occurs, the blood volume decreases because of water loss, and the concentration of the plasma proteins increase. And then the increase in the blood colloid osmotic pressure accelerates reabsorption. You have a recall of fluids that delays the onset and severity of certain clinical problems that are caused by low blood volume and blood pressure. And if your hydrostatic pressure rises above that blood colloid osmotic pressure is decreasing, let me try it again. If the hydrostatic pressure rises or the blood colloid osmotic pressure decreases, fluid is going to move out of the blood in the capillaries and it's going to build up in the peripheral tissues. That is called edema. And that happens quite often. We have all kinds of homeostatic mechanisms in place to try to maintain the right movement. This ensures adequate tissue perfusion, which means blood flow through the tissues. And we want the blood flow to match the changes in demand for oxygen and nutrients. The regulatory pathways here for the homeostasis: autoregulation, which happens at that local level. Again, it means self, so only at that local level. And central regulation, where you now involve neural and endocrine control. That's activated if the autoregulation is not working. So let's look at autoregulation. Again, this is local changes in blood flow within capillary beds. And the way we regulate it is by the precapillary sphincters, and they're responding to certain chemical changes in the interstitial fluid. So the chemicals that are in this area that increase blood flow are called vasodilators. And this chart shows these homeostatic mechanisms in play. Kind of shows both sides of autoregulation. Okay, and actually let me go over it real quickly. So they show here homeostasis is disturbed by chemical changes, maybe decreased oxygen or pH or increased CO2 or prostaglandins. You have increased tissue activity, maybe physical stress, trauma, high local temperature. The precapillary sphincters respond. You have local decreases in resistance, increase in blood flow, and therefore you increase homeostasis because you increase your blood flow at that point, and it's restored. Now, on the other hand, down here they show the central regulation. And we're going to go to that here. So this involves neural and endocrine mechanisms. The neural part is when we activate the cardioacceleratory center. And we're activating the vasomotor centers that control the peripheral vasoconstriction. What's going to happen here is an increase in your cardiac output and a reduction in the blood flow to any non-essential or inactive tissues. Your endocrine control, you release vasoconstrictors like norepinephrine. That's going to give you a long-term increase in blood pressure. You also have baroreceptor reflexes. They respond to changes in blood pressure. And these are local. The receptors are located in the walls of the carotid sinuses, the aortic sinuses, the right atrium. Any of the responses to the baroreceptor stimulation? Well, the cardiac centers will decrease cardiac output by parasympathetic stimulation and sympathetic inhibition. So there is a central control. And then we have a widespread peripheral vasodilation because of inhibition of the vasomotor center of the medulla oblongata in this case, if the baroreceptor reflexes kick in. So in this chart, we see the baroreceptors in the carotid sinuses and aortic arch are kicking in because you have an increase in blood pressure. This causes the effectors in the medulla oblongata to be reactive. The cardioinhibitory centers are stimulated, the cardioacceleratory centers are inhibited, and the vasomotor centers are inhibited. So in this first case, we get a decreased cardiac output. In the second case, vasodilation. In both cases, it reduces your blood pressure. And we restored homeostasis again, decreasing the blood pressure. Now, if you have decreased baroreceptor stimulation, the cardiac centers will increase cardiac output through the stimulation of the sympathetic innervation to the heart, as we were showing. And that results from stimulation of the cardioacceleratory centers, and again, accompanied by inhibition of the cardioinhibitory centers. You have widespread peripheral vasoconstriction that's caused by stimulation of the vasomotor centers. And if you have a crisis, like major blood loss, the sympathetic activation occurs, norepinephrine and epinephrine kick in, the net effect here, an increase in cardiac output and some generalized vascular constriction. And that will elevate your blood pressure. Okay, so in this chart we see decreasing blood pressure for whatever reason. The baroreceptors in the carotid sinuses and aortic arch are receiving this stimulus. The baroreceptors get inhibited. The effectors, your medulla oblongata, specifically the cardiovascular centers. The vasomotor center is stimulated. That results in vasoconstriction. The cardioacceleratory center is stimulated and the cardioinhibitory center is inhibited. It gives you increased cardiac output. Both of these things will lead to increased blood pressure. Okay. Let's talk about some specific endocrine responses to low blood pressure and low blood volume. So again, keep in mind that the nervous system is the one that reacts the quickest and has short-term effects. Endocrine system takes a little bit longer to react, but has longer-term effects. In this case, when it comes to low blood pressure and low blood volume, we can have some short-term effects. Again, most of the time endocrine is long-term, but we're going to have effects on the heart, the kidneys, and the pituitary gland. So let's say we have low blood pressure and volume. The immediate response is release of epinephrine and norepinephrine. They're released from the adrenal medulla. We also have other hormones released though. Antidiuretic hormone, angiotensin II, erythropoietin, aldosterone. Hopefully those terms are not new to you. Okay, so in this chart, we have decrease in blood pressure and volume. Short-term effects, the baroreceptors know this is happening. You can have sympathetic activation and release of the adrenal hormones epinephrine and norepinephrine, which are going to affect the heart and blood vessels, and they're going to increase cardiac output and peripheral vasoconstriction. The long-term effect is on the kidneys. And the endocrine response, erythropoietin is going to cause increased red blood cell formation. Renin is going to be released that leads to angiotensin II activation. That's going to cause antidiuretic hormone to be released and aldosterone to be secreted, and it's going to cause you to be thirsty. And those things combined will increase your blood pressure and increase your blood volume, and it brings your blood pressure and volume back up. Okay, what about high blood pressure and blood volume? Well, your high blood volume is going to stretch the heart walls at diastole. This triggers the release of natriuretic peptides. And you remember this was one of the few hormones the heart itself produces. It's released from the right atrial wall. There's also a brain natriuretic peptide released from ventricular muscle cells. A decrease in blood volume and pressure is going to equal decreased stress on the heart walls and therefore decreased production of natriuretic peptide. So in this chart you see we have increasing blood pressure and volume. The cardiac muscle cells have receptors that react by releasing natriuretic peptides. Kidneys and blood vessels then are going to respond. They're going to increase the sodium loss in your urine, increase water loss in urine, reduce your thirst, inhibit ADH, aldosterone, epinephrine, norepinephrine release. Peripheral vasodilation will occur, and all of these things together will decrease your blood pressure and your blood volume. Okay, the chemoreceptor reflexes. So they're going to respond to the blood and cerebrospinal fluid changes with carbon dioxide, oxygen, and pH changes. These receptors are located in the carotid bodies, and the aortic bodies, the ventrolateral surface of the medulla oblongata. And stimulation of those receptors will trigger coordinated adjustments in your cardiovascular and your respiratory activity. Okay, here we have increasing CO2 levels and decreasing pH and oxygen levels. So when you increase CO2, CO2 combines with water and gives you basically carbonic acid. So the chemoreceptors in the carotid and aortic bodies and the medulla oblongata are going to respond. The chemoreceptors are stimulated. So in the medulla oblongata, the respiratory centers then get stimulated, and the cardiovascular centers operate. The cardioacceleratory center is stimulated, the cardioinhibitory center is inhibited, and the vasomotor center gets stimulated. So as a result of the respiratory centers getting stimulated, you're going to get increased respiratory rate. So quicker breaths, but not deep breaths, okay? And as a result of the cardiovascular centers responding, you're going to get increased cardiac output and blood pressure. At the same time, you're getting vasoconstriction. That's going to give you increased cardiac output and blood pressure. And eventually, you're going to get increased pH because you're actually getting rid of a lot more CO2 when you breathe quickly, hyperventilation, and oxygen levels and decreased CO2 levels. And that restores everything back to where it's supposed to be. The cardiovascular adjustments at rest, you have a cardiac output of about 5,800 milliliters per minute. During light exercise, there's three changes taking place. You have vasodilation, you have peripheral resistance dropping, you have capillary blood flow increasing. Why might you do that during light exercise? What are you needing to happen when you're exercising a little bit? What do you have a need for? Oxygen and some nutrients, right? So you can, metabolisms occur. Venous return increases with skeletal muscle contraction. You have increased respiration that creates negative pressure in the thoracic cavity, drawing blood back. So you have the respiratory pump occurring. Cardiac output increases to 9,500 milliliters per minute, mainly because of the venous return. So look at the differences you see here. And you'll see some major changes with some of the organs, not as much with the others. During heavy exercise, your cardiac output approaches maximal levels, about 17,500 milliliters per minute. You have major changes in the peripheral blood distribution that allows large increases in flow to your skeletal muscles without overall decrease in your systemic blood pressure. You have increased flow to the skeletal muscles, increased flow to the skin, so you have more heat loss. You have reduced flow to the digestive viscera and kidneys, because you don't need to be digesting things while you're, say, running or swimming. You want all your energy to go to the organs that are necessary to be operating. Your brain blood flow also, well, it remains unchanged for the most part. So this shows the decreases and increases that happen. Notice as you're going from left to right here, from rest to heavy exercise, notice how blood flow into, say, the abdominal viscera changes greatly and decreases. But some areas it actually increases, right? So cardiovascular performance improves with training. Trained athletes have bigger hearts, larger stroke volumes. They can maintain normal blood flow with lower heart rates. Maximal cardiac output can be 50% higher than non-athletes. We do have compensation mechanisms in us. When hemostasis fails to prevent significant blood loss, your entire cardiovascular system will adjust to compensate. Your immediate problem, maintenance of blood pressure and peripheral blood flow. Long-term problem is restoring the blood volume. So your mechanisms will cope with blood losses equal to about 30% of your total blood volume. So here's your short-term response if you have a lot of blood loss. So your carotid and aortic reflexes increase the cardiac output. They cause peripheral vasoconstriction. Cardiac output's maintained by increasing your heart rate. A combination of stress and anxiety stimulates the sympathetic nervous system that causes an increase in the vasomotor tone, constricting the arterioles and increasing blood pressure. At the same time, your venoconstriction, constriction of large and medium-sized veins, improves venous return that shifts the blood into the arterial system. And the sympathetic activation causes secretion of epinephrine and norepinephrine by the adrenal medulla. This increases cardiac output, extending your peripheral vasoconstriction. And you have a release of the antidiuretic hormone by the neurohypophysis. The production of angiotensin II enhances vasoconstriction. And antidiuretic hormone participates in long-term responses. Long-term responses, decreasing your blood capillary pressure that triggers recall of fluids from the interstitial space. Aldosterone and antidiuretic hormone will promote the fluid retention and reabsorption by the kidneys. Your thirst increases. Additional water is obtained by absorption across the digestive tract. And erythropoietin will stimulate maturing of red blood cells in the red bone marrow, which gives you increased blood volume and improved oxygen delivery. Okay, so this table puts all of that together. Homeostatic responses to decrease blood pressure and volume if you have extensive bleeding. So I would spend some time and look at that chart. I think that would be a particularly good one for you to look at as you move along. And I think we are going to stop there, and we'll talk about 19.13 next.